Welcome to the Today Dreamer podcast, a project that's dedicated to helping you cultivate your own practice of presence. My name's Michael and I'm your host. I'm a meditation teacher, a musician, a mentor, and a conversationalist that's currently based in Melbourne, Australia. And it's my hope that through listening to these conversations and through these kind of shared spaces, that you'll be able to feel more empowered and more enabled in participating and contributing to the blossoming of the emergent world story. So hopefully you find some clarity through these chats, some inspiration and motivation. This is a part 2 of a 2-part series. So if you haven't yet, I would like to kind of point you to part 1 to have a listen. And if you have, then sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode. Before we do get into it, I would like to invite you to pause with me for a moment as we have the space to just be through the practice of an inhalation and exhalation. Feel free to focus in on one object in the distance in your field of vision, or you may even like to close your eyes for a moment. And as slowly and gracefully as you possibly can, there's a nice, gentle, open invitation to begin to inhale through the nostrils, noticing any subtleties of your experience. You might like to just pause for a moment at the peak of your inhalation before gently releasing just as slowly and gracefully on the way out. There's an open invitation to continue this process as we lead into part 2 of this conversation. You might like to continue all the way through. Yeah. Let's get into it.
So what I've, the way I've worked out teaching on the judgmental mind, which I've been doing for about 20 years, and it came out of about 4 years of closely examining my own judgmental mind in different contexts. Partly working with a psychotherapist. Some of it was in a meditative context, working with a wonderful teacher, John Travis, who was a really close mentor to me for 4 years. And what I came to see from a lot of looking, including, I read the breakthrough was when I worked with mindfulness of my own judgmental mind at a 2-month meditation retreat, looking at it over and over again, 20, 30 times a day or more, and doing that for 60 days. And so what I came to see, and it's been refined because I've kind of developed a whole curriculum for this. What I've come to see is that what I'm calling the judgmental mind, and we'll talk for the moment about being with unpleasant, the judgmental mind in relationship to the unpleasant. What I've seen is that the judgmental mind is connected with some kind of noticing, sometimes discernment, linked with reactivity.
Mm-hmm.
And from the earlier discussion, we can see that the reactivity, in the case of being with the unpleasant, is in relationship to something that was unpleasant or painful. And what I came to see was that the judgmental mind, strangely, is a kind of defense mechanism, because I'm actually using it, and I'm not experiencing what was painful in my experience. So for example, a very important experience in my own learning process came when I was a co-chair, or let's say let me back up. I was working with a boss in the organization where I was working, and I met with him, I don't know, once every 2 weeks or something for a year or two. And I found, and I started experiencing, I thought that he wasn't listening well to me. I'd say something and he would often change the subject. And I would notice myself, it took some time to really notice the dynamics, but over time I could see clearly I would withdraw emotionally from this hour and a half conversation to a place of emotionally distanced moral superiority, where I would be, I'd be out of the discussion, one not really there, but I'd be judgmental of him. And over time, this was with some guidance, I came to see that there was a painful experience for me. I thought he's not listening to me. I thought I wasn't being heard, but I didn't, I didn't experience it as painful. I just went right to being judgmental. And I wasn't really aware that this was painful for me. What I did with some guidance is I could, it took a little bit of time to see the dynamics and that this was coming out of me thinking he's not listening to me. And then I would, I could notice, okay, this is something that's there in many parts of my experience, not just with this guy, but that thinking someone's not listening to me is,
So the patterning, yeah.
It's a pattern, or as we would say, it's an issue. Right? And so then I could start to look for, try to be mindful when that happens and try to track, okay, see what it's like when he doesn't listen to you. And then I would notice, oh, that doesn't feel good. And I could actually tune in and feel that it's painful. When I actually could do that and tune in the moment and feel it was painful, I would not go to being judgmental, but rather I could then actually be more in the moment in a non-reactive way and say something like, the point I just made is important to me. Can we come back to that? Right. In other words, I could respond to the situation non-reactively. And it came from being able to actually touch what was painful. Now, in some situations, we can do that, like in something analogous to what I described, but this really helped inform like a general strategy for working with the judgmental mind, which was to see that the reactivity is there because there's something painful that we're actually not touching. In some situations, we might be able to go back and touch it, something like what I did to, I don't know, I hear something in the news, maybe I hear something about Ukraine, right, which is happening right now, the war in Ukraine. And I get really judgmental towards, let's say, towards the Russians, right? And in large part, that being judgmental is helping me not to feel the sadness or the sorrow or the grief or the anger there. Maybe the anger might be more there. And so I could, if I'm well trained, I could actually go back, oh, I think this, me being judgmental is telling me I need to really sit with the pain. So you can see how this would be a huge issue for activists, right? Activists who are dealing with painful social situations all the time, if they don't actually touch the pain, they will be reactive on the basis of something important. They have discernment. They're noticing, let's say, injustice or something, something not okay, but they will go off and be reactive, which could result in them demonizing their opponents, or what I have found with actually working with activists is that this probably most frequently results in them being reactive and judgmental towards fellow activists. That's probably the most common. but you can see how, so it becomes a strategy from studying the judgmental mind this way. The understanding of the judgmental mind is that it's some kind of noticing linked with reactivity. The reactivity is there because there's something unpleasant. And so if I can somehow go back and work with the reactivity, a major way is of touching the pain that leads to the reactivity, which sometimes can be done easily. Sometimes it can take, when we're looking at some old pattern, maybe from childhood, it can take 6 months, a year, 3 years to really touch that thoroughly and transform it. But the formula becomes transform the reactivity and take whatever is valid or intelligent or reflecting discernment in the judgment and use that for the purposes of compassionate action. Like in my example with the boss, I could notice, it's important for me to notice that he's not listening to me. I want to keep that, even though it's the basis for my being judgmental. I want to transform the reactivity, keep that insight, and then respond to him and saying, this issue is important to me, let's deal with it. Or it could be, in the activist context, it could be working with my own grief towards the situation, or my own anger, and working deeply with that so I can then approach social transformation as much as possible without reactivity. And so if you look to, for example, the way that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. guided the civil rights movement, I would say his approach is deeply, deeply aligned with what I'm mentioning. He said that the heart of our movement is the transformation of anger, which is understandable, right? Right? We have received injustice, and he was coming from the perception that if we just let the anger and the rage operate without wisdom and compassion, it will be self-destructive, right? So that's an example at the level of activism. So the formula becomes transform the reactivity, and then go back to whatever insight or discernment or noticing there is. And sometimes that will be more obvious and sometimes not so clear. And use that for the purposes of skillful action, compassionate action. So you could see, okay, Dr. King is saying, work with your anger. Your anger is coming out of profound experience of injustice. Keep that understanding, but then work for transformation, right? Something like that. And so, or in the example with my boss, I could respond skillfully, or, I could be really, like when I was working with this, it was at the same time I was coming significantly more into being a Dharma teacher, being we would say a Buddhist-based teacher. And I was giving a lot more talks, and sometimes I'd be very critical of my own talks. But I was doing this at a point when I was right in the work, I was fully in the working with the judgmental mind. And so I would use different practices, and I noticed myself getting really hard on myself 20 minutes after I finished a talk. That wasn't a good talk. And I would actually do a practice which would let me actually, there are practices I've used and developed that would help me actually touch that underlying pain. So I would, I got to the point where I could actually, in a very short time, notice myself judgmental, go into my experience, notice, oh, when I go there, oh, I'm sad. I wish I had prepared more. Stayed with that sadness. I could, at that point, had been doing a lot of it. I could stay with the sadness for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, just hang out with the sadness, which we could call the pain of the situation. And something like a child having a good cry the judgments would dry up. They wouldn't be there anymore.
Drying up in the tears.
That example gives sort of the formula. Like I say, I've been doing it a lot. I've been doing, I was coming after 25 years of spiritual practice. And so there's a background. And so sometimes it can be relatively quick like that. And sometimes if we haven't done that kind of work, or if it's very deeply embedded in, let's say, material from childhood or trauma or something like that, then it can take a lot more time. Although we can get to the point where it's something like what I just described.
Yes. I appreciate you sharing that. I had just what comes up for me when you're mentioning these practices, a couple of things. I've had a recent experience where I've been able to meditate on, I was just like laying on the floor into a feeling of anger that I didn't really know was present before. I was like, oh, this is actually anger. And as soon as it happened a lot quicker than 5 or 10 minutes. It was like as soon as that place was touched, it began to change. And for 40 minutes prior, it was just intensifying. So yeah, it was very, and it was almost like a real physical experience. Like my whole body was shaking, and there was this kind of, was quite strange. Yeah, but
that's basically it. I mean, basically being present to whatever's happening in the long run is healing and transformative. So because
it's magical. It feels like magic.
It's magical, and anger is also an emotion that particularly is amenable to that, because anger often covers over some other emotion. Psychologists often call anger a cover emotion. And so if you stay with anger, like in my example, you could come to maybe come to sadness. And I had one retreat where I was angry for 10 days in a row for 16 hours a day.
Sounds like a good time.
And it was in the workable range. It wasn't too much. That made it possible for me to basically practice mindfulness of anger for all that time. And it was so illuminating, because I found that, very often, the anger, when I stayed with it, would shift into sadness. And sometimes the sadness, when I stayed with it, would shift into love. So, a lot of social justice people have said that anger, beneath anger, is actually love. And if we can actually touch the love, then activism becomes totally different.
You mentioned this kind of reactivity that takes place in terms of, we're talking about this kind of context of activism, this reactivity that takes place. And then, we've gone through this process of touching these spaces, and then maybe eventually getting to a space of love. It seems to be the case for me that at some point it's like, well, what's next? And there is a period of not really knowing where to go from that.
Where to go from love?
Not where to go from love, but almost like,
I think, of course, we don't want to go anywhere from love.
Yeah, definitely. That's more of, I think, what we were talking to earlier about the not doing. But there's a sense of once a space has been touched, maybe it hasn't got to the point where it's transformed into this kind of immense sense of love, but it's almost like the reactivity. It's almost like the doing from that point is automatic. So it's there, but it can't. Sometimes it's not so clear what to do when we step out of the reactivity, I guess.
You mean, let's say I'm angry and reactive, and then you maybe do an inner process like what you described, and the reactivity falls away.
Yeah. So I'll give you maybe a personal example, and then so I've got this. It kind of intertwines with a few themes that we've explored, but there's this idea of kind of ambition and trajectory, I guess, and a feeling of judgment that comes up for me when I feel like I'm in some way, I don't want to say on track or not on track. So I think if we zoom out enough, it always seems to be the same thing. But there's a judgment that comes up, like a beating myself up around that. And I've
Yeah.
noticed this kind of stepping away from that and kind of becoming more comfortable in the space of not needing to know, or not having to have the answers
Yeah.
of where to go. But there seems to be there's a couple of things that I've noticed happen. One of them is that when the answer does kind of reveal itself, there is a sense of then the inertia for not having it for that little while. It's a gradual build up before there's movement, if that makes sense. And I'm trying to tie this back into, I'm running around in circles a little bit, but there was this sense of kind of moving through this reactionary stage, but then there's that period of the not knowing, and that can feel quite, for me personally, like there's a tension in that space. So I guess I wanted to kind of voice that and see what you had to say, but maybe that would
Yeah.
be useful as an example as well.
Yeah. Let me see if I can understand, if I understand you accurately. So let's say that there's some kind of judgments about your own trajectory, or this approach is working out or not working out, and you're having some judgmental thoughts related to that, and then you sort of bring, let's say, awareness to that, and they fall away, and you're in a place of, and you invite a kind of not knowing as to, let's say, what's happening with my trajectory. But then you're saying that doesn't feel entirely comfortable. Is that accurate to what you're identifying?
Well, there's this kind of, I guess there can be a comfort. There's a comfort in the idea of what we mentioned earlier about the beauty of each step, and then having that focusing on the presence rather than having to know, I guess. But then there seems to be a discomfort with the sense of planning, and
with the sense of,
it's like planning or checking in whether the steps are in the right direction. It's still there, I guess. It's still kind of comes and goes.
First of all, where I've gone with the judgmental mind work, it really is related to going into the depths of how we understand or how we identify as a self. And the conditioning that virtually all of us received from family and society when we were young about, doing things okay or being good is so thick. And so a lot of what I described about the judgmental mind work is probably the first, it's very significant, but it's how we initially approach it. And then over time, we go more deeply into what I and also a number of psychologists talk about as limiting beliefs, which typically are formed in childhood. They can be formed later, and they're going to they can be very, very active, and it takes generally a long time to see what they are and transform them. So many of us have some version of perfectionism, for example, which, the limiting belief would be something like, I need to be perfect, or I need to be perfect to receive love, or some version of that. And that, when I do show of hands when I'm teaching, it's like a third of the people or a half have some version of that, right? And they're different versions. And so those are going to be extremely persistent. And we're not talking about a weekend workshop. Okay, took care of that one. Right? Those are where, we can work with them, and they can maybe diminish, and we can carve out more free space, but those generally take time, for most people, maybe not for everyone, so yeah, I think of one person I worked with, had very difficult childhood where his father and his brother, his older brother, would gang up on him, and they would tell him, you're going to mess up today. And they told him that when he was starting maybe 7 or 8. And I started working with him when he was in his late 50s. He had, for years and years, every morning, he had the thought, I'm going to mess up today. It came from childhood. And we could have done it, we could call that a limiting belief, or maybe use a little different language to describe it, but that was very strong for him. And yet, because of neuroplasticity that the neuropsychologists tell us about, these can be transformed. They get transformed not by eliminating them, but by developing, as it were, alternative neural pathways.
And you were saying earlier about kind of the way in is, in a sense, the way out as well. And there's a depth on the way there, and there's a depth on the way back. And what you're saying now is really linking to what you're mentioning around and this idea of the social conditioning, and maybe like a contemporary map that's needed.
Yeah, that's right. And maybe just one point to tie it back to what you were talking about. If they're, talking about how is the trajectory of my work going, these are going to, for most people, tie into pretty primal material, right? And so you can, I don't know if you think that way, but for most people, talking about how is my work going, how is my trajectory going of my work, my life, my relationship, whatever, this is pretty primal. And so even if you do a certain amount of inner work and then try to say, okay, let me just be open about what happens, the conditioning is strong. And it's going to, particularly at moments of vulnerability, it's going to say, hey, shouldn't you pin this down a little bit more? I don't know about this open stuff. Right. And so it's fairly insistent. And nonetheless, cultivating openness and equanimity is a valuable part of things. And I maybe to link up with the question you asked, I have found this kind of conditioning in myself. I was saying that the beginning of the close work with this happened after 25 years of spiritual practice, right? And I've met people, I've sometimes taught our long retreats at Spirit Rock, where people do intensive meditation for a month to 2 months at a time. And I meet people who have done practice for years, deep commitment, often very deep insights, who definitely have residues of the judgmental mind or of these limiting beliefs and so forth. And so it's, I have found that for most people, one has to do specific practices that get at this kind of conditioning. Call it psychological conditioning or social conditioning. It's a mix, but so I see the work I've developed on the judgmental mind as complementary to traditional practices, which came out of a very different setting. There wasn't the same kind of contemporary psyche. The practices were, they get at a lot of things, but they don't necessarily, let's say, get at the limiting beliefs. I can see that from my own experience, my own practice. In a similar way, I think traditional teachings don't necessarily get at different forms of social conditioning around gender or race or ethnicity or sexual orientation or age or religion, whatever. And so I have felt a need to develop these well-developed curricula that give people developed practices that get at psychological and social conditioning and people's material in those areas, and have reflected on what a contemporary map of what we might call awakening looks like. Thinking that how do we integrate the traditional map with forms that are developing in our times. And I think this is part of the kind of the zeitgeist, as it were, of our
Yeah.
times. A lot of people are drawn by this, whether they know that or not.
Yeah, I feel like people are, I think I've just caught a glimpse of people working on this kind of a thing in different spaces.
Yeah.
With different languages and in different ways. And it's
Yeah.
quite an exciting kind of time.
It's
You know,
powerful
yeah.
because it's, in a simple way, we could ask, what practices do we need that gets at our stuff? And
Mhm.
then we have to identify what's our stuff.
Mhm.
And then, if we identify that, and then we ask, well, okay, how do traditional practices get at my limiting beliefs, let's say, or my conditioning around race? And well, they help in some ways, but do they get at it in a full and transformative way? I would say no,
Mhm.
that we need specific contemporary understandings and practices that help us do this.
This, I guess, maybe a place to kind of begin to close things off would be around Thai's statement, the next Buddha will take the form of a community.
That's
And
right.
I
Yeah.
really felt that was a powerful sharing that you provided. I really appreciate that. Um, yeah, I was wondering kind of what ideas, thoughts, feelings, visions comes up for you in your heart and your mind when you read that, or when you speak those words.
About what Thich Nhat Hanh said.
Yes.
He said the next Buddha will be a community. Yeah, I mean, Thich Nhat Hanh has been a major influence on me, and I studied with him a number of times and visited Plum Village. And so he's been very significant for me, partly as the pioneer of socially engaged Buddhism, even, one of the persons who coined the very phrase engaged Buddhism,
Mm.
and coming out of his experience in Vietnam, and out of the experience of the Vietnamese Buddhist communities, probably starting in the 1930s. So yeah, it's I think what comes to me is that there's this sense of the importance of the vital importance of community, and this is something which has sometimes been overlooked, certainly in Western Buddhist settings, where although there are many aspects of community, I think it can play a much larger role in our practice. So I've been very interested in, we haven't talked about it, but I've been very interested in the practice of wise speech and communication as a fundamental part of practice, and of the sort of the relational dimension of practice. Often in the way Western Buddhism has been framed, and by Western Buddhism, I should say more coming out of centers like Insight Meditation Society, Spirit Rock, as juxtaposed with maybe some of the, like the Thai or Burmese temples, where I think there always has been more of an emphasis on community. But in some of the settings that I mentioned, like Spirit Rock, Insight Meditation Society, community has been there, but it often has been sort of second. And the notion is that the ultimate nature of practice is meditating by oneself, maybe in a retreat, but meditating by oneself. That's where things happen. And so I think Thich Nhat Hanh is really bringing out the centrality of communal practice and the community dimension of practice. And I think that manifests on many, many levels, both in terms of making relational community-wide practices more explicit, developing them. For example, I work with, I've been teaching retreats this year and last year on Buddhist practice and transforming racism. And that, there's a certain amount one can do by oneself, like reading, study, watching one's mind. But so much of it needs to happen and has been happening when I've been teaching it with groups, on a group level. So that's one level. I think that's a very important dimension. I think Thich Nhat Hanh's also suggesting that there's, we might say, awakening evolves. That awakening has a different nature in our time than it may have had 2,600 years ago. That's interesting, right? That there's an evolution both about who awakens and what the map of awakening is like. And so so there's a sense of it being different. And I think the last, maybe one of the last points I'd make is that even though I would say, from my own perspective, the next Buddha will be a community or a Sangha, I think also that's not to take away from the fact that individuals can awaken. So, and that maybe the full awakening is as a community, but there can be deep, deep levels of awakening as individuals. And so in other words, there's both continuity with the traditional model, and then there's innovation. Both are true.
Thank you for your time today, Donald.
Well, it's been a pleasure. It went very, very quickly.
Yeah,
I had a sense of not being in time in the usual way.
I think that feels like a nice thing to hear. Thank you for your participation in this episode of the Today Dreamer podcast. I'll leave links on our beautiful guest in the show notes section on the website, where you can check out all their wonderful work and offerings. And if you're interested in working one-on-one with me, feel free to head over to todaydreamer.com and get in touch. Also, if you're a part of the Today Dreamer family, which really only means that you've listened to one full episode and you'd like to go deeper to at least one full episode, then and you'd like to participate in some group meditation sessions online that I'm offering for free only to listeners of the show, then please send me an email through the contact form on the website. I'll add you to the list, and I'll give you all the details to that and any other upcoming kind of offerings around helping your development in this space. Thank you so much again, and until next time, be present, feel alive, and be well.